All right, so let's get into it. The first groupings are the epaxial and the hypaxial. We're going to be looking at the epaxial in this video. Please, again, be following along with your lab manual. We are in lab 5. All right, so ways to determine between epaxial and hypaxial. Epaxial, these are considered to be your true back muscles, and then hypaxial, these are more of body wall muscles. Okay. Epaxial can also be described as muscles that are dorsal to the transverse processes of the vertebrae, whereas hypaxial are going to be ventral to the transverse processes. So I have obviously a very, anatomically correct vertebrae here. So here we have the spinous process, and on the sides facing laterally, we have the transverse processes. Okay. The epaxial muscles will be dorsal, meaning posterior to those processes. So they will be more so along these directions. So they'll be maybe having attachment points to the transverse or maybe the spinous processes, whereas the hypaxial will be ventral or anterior to the transverse processes. So it'll look more like on that side, on the anterior side, closer to the body of the vertebrae. Okay, so we are diving into epaxial. Now, for a lot of these muscle groups, they in the lab manual, there's a good chunk of little, tidbits and fun facts about these muscles. Definitely take a gander at that. Read through them if you need to. Um, Also, you'll notice with these groupings, there may be superficial, intermediate, and deep subgroups of these muscles. Definitely something to pay attention to. Um, we are going to be starting with uh, superficial epaxial muscles. However, we can't get to these muscles until we remove trapezius and latissimus dorsi. These are muscles that we're going to be discussing in lab 6, so part 2 of chapter 11. So we'll come back to these and why they're not considered to be the true back muscles. So we're going to just pretend we're on the cadaver and we are removing those from our view. All right, we're going to get underneath these two muscles. And here we have this first and only really superficial epaxial muscle. Okay, so everything else in the epaxial muscle group is going to be deep to this muscle. So the interesting thing about this muscle is that splenius is actually split into 2 different muscles. All right. So that's why in your lab manual it says splenius and then in parentheses capitis and cervicus. Now, for my lecture course, I do not need you to know the difference between these 2 muscles. We can just group them together and call them splenius. Splenius, excuse me. All right. So if we're looking at splenius, we are observing maybe first the muscle fibers and just trying to identify how these fibers are arranged, essentially. So to me, I can kind of see that, okay, they're sort of attached right here along the midline, and it's extending in this direction. Okay, so it's kind of starting medially and then coming lateral and superior. All right. So that's typically how we want to start anytime we're looking at an image of a muscle. We want to try and find out and visualize where it's actually attaching to. All right. And that'll help us determine origin and insertion actual points. All right. So again, splenius is weird because it is split into 2 different parts. And so when you look at the origin and the insertion, there's 2 different origins and there's 2 different insertions because there's 2 different muscles of splenius. Okay. So let's just deal with the origin first. All right. So one portion of the origin, use my blue marker here, one portion of the origin is going to be more posterior. on the inferior portion of the skull, which we know is the occipital bone. Okay, that's one origin of one of the splenius muscles. The other origin is going to be along the spinous processes of T1 through T6. So we can see that this must be T1 all the way down T6. Okay, so these are also going to be the origins. All right. Now, for the insertion, the transverse processes of C1 and C4, so remember the transverse processes are going to be those lateral extensions, and we're talking about on the cervical vertebrae. So they're kind of hidden up here along the neck. So this would be one insertion kind of down here and along the other side as well. And then the mastoid process as well as the occipital bone. So the remaining portion of the splinous that you can see attaching to the occipital bone, and then how it kind of swoops laterally to connect behind where our ear is, we know that that's the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So that's where the other insertion would be. So this is just a weird muscle to kind of start out with because we have these muscles within muscles for the splenius. All right. So again, I'm not going to test you on the specific type, like capitis and cervicus for this muscle, but you do need to understand the different the both origins and both insertions for this muscle. All right. So now we move on to the action. So anytime we talk about an action, I need you to visualize. You're looking at this muscle right now, and I'm going to get rid of my annotation so we can have a clear view. All right. We're going to just look at this muscle. And when we think about an action, we have to think, okay, the muscle is contracting. When the muscle contracts, it gets shorter. All right. So the muscle is going to move towards each other. I feel like it's contracting, and so the muscle fibers are going to move towards each other. Okay, and so a large muscle is then going to become shorter. All right, and we know that the action is produced by the muscle contracting at the insertion point. And we said that the insertion was up here along the neck as well as the cervical vertebrae, right? And not the neck, sorry, along the occipital bone and the mastoid process of the temporal bone, right? So the muscle is going to contract and it's going to pull the body in this direction. All right, so you have to visualize this muscle getting shorter. So the action is going to be extending the head. So essentially, the head is going to be tilted posteriorly because it's pulling at the back of the head. Now, because this muscle is on both sides of the body, you can just ignite and contract one side, and that's where we have that unilateral description in our lab manual, where we're laterally flexing the neck and like kind of like moving your head towards one shoulder. That would be contracting the splenius on only one side, so it would be a unilateral contraction. Okay, but if it's a bilateral contraction, then both are igniting and we're moving the head as a whole posteriorly, tilting your head back. So, one thing that is helpful in learning the muscles is just like we did with the bones, touch the bones, okay? Touch the location of these muscles, right? Just like we did with the bones. So, the splenius we know is going to be along and it's on the superficial side, so we're almost touching the splenius on the back of our neck. All right, we know that it's inserting on the occipital and temporal bone, so we can extend our head posteriorly, right? And we can feel that contraction. We can feel that muscle igniting. All right. So let's talk now about innervation. So this is about the nerves that are going to stimulate that contraction. All right. So in the manual, it's listed as cervical and thoracic dorsal rami of spinal nerves. What in the heck does that mean? Okay. So let's just kind of break that apart for a second. So cervical and thoracic. Well, that kind of makes sense though, if we just think about that, because it was originating on the it was originating on the thoracic vertebrae, on those spinous processes, right? And it was then inserting up on the cervical. All right, so we have those two locations we already are aware of, that are those locations are involved for this muscle. So for an innervation to be stimulated from those regions, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so then let's talk about the rest of it, right? Dorsal rami of spinal nerves. So with that, we've got to look at the anatomy of the spinal cord, which we'll come back to when we get to the spinal cord, of course. But here we have a vertebrae and the little tiny spinal cord inside. All right. Coming off of the spinal cord, we have these branches. We have the posterior root and we have the anterior root. And as it kind of gets to this region right here, it becomes the spinal nerve. Now, after it becomes the spinal nerve, it branches. And it has a ventral ramus, which when we say ramus, that's the singular, and that's going to be one branch. Okay. And that's going to go in the anterior or the ventral direction. And then we have, again, the X is representing the spinal nerve. After the spinal nerve, we also have another branch that extends dorsal, all right, that goes posteriorly. And so again, ramus is a singular term. So for the innervation of splenius, we have cervical and thoracic dorsal rami. Rami, R-M-I, R-A-M-I, that is going to be the plural. All right, so all of these dorsal rami, this branch that's going in the dorsal direction of the body for cervical and thoracic regions, are going to be stimulating and innervating this muscle. Okay. All right. So splenius is such a strange one to really start out with because it is muscles within muscles. But from here, we can now go into our similarities or commonalities between the rest of this group. Okay, so we're still in epaxial muscles. If you flip your page in your lab manual, I'm flipping with you, all right, we can see that we go to the next grouping, which is kind of a subgrouping, but we have 3 muscles in this chart, all right. If we're look at the innervations. The innervations are all the same for the next 4 muscles on the next page, all part of the epaxial. The only exception for the epaxial muscles that doesn't share the same innervation is the multifidus muscle. All right, and we'll talk about that. So you can find that commonality, right? So if you're learning the epaxial muscles, you just have to know the innervation once, essentially. And then looking back at the action for splenius muscle, it also is shared between longissimus and semispinalis. So all 3 of those muscles are going to have the same action. All right. So finding the similarities or commonalities helps you study, as well as physically putting your hands at the location of those muscles, finding those origin points and tracing the muscle down to the insertion point, and then actually performing the action that's going to be a sure guarantee to help you memorize these. Because guess what? You can bring your body with you to the exam, okay? And you can practice and you can do those, have that muscle memory of doing these actions and finding these muscles, and it will help you so much. If I don't see movement of like crazy, like flexing and abducting on the exam, I'm going to be super sad. All right. So practice it. All right. So let's move on to that subgroup of the superficial epaxial muscles. All right. So we have three in this subgroup, right? These are the erector spinae group. They're still considered superficial epaxial muscles, right? So we have the iliocostylis, the longissimus, and the spinalis. Cool thing about these is that if you look, iliocostylis is most lateral, longissimus, intermediate, and then spinalis is most medial. Okay, so it's kind of working its way towards the medial portion of the body. All right. Now, lucky for us in this subgroup, all of these muscles are going to have the same origin. So we found a similarity. So the erector spinae group all have the same innervation, which again are still going to be the cervical and thoracic dorsal rami of the spinal nerves, just like this the the splenius, right? So that's already done. We've got that mastered. And now they're all going to have the same origin. So finding these commonalities is just making less work for yourself. Okay, so let's talk about what that origin is for all of these muscles. We're going inferiorly, right? So we are looking at the iliac crest. So you can see the iliac crest for all of these muscles. Also the posterior sacrum. You can see posterior sacrum. Fantastic. As well as the inferior lumbar and sacral spinous processes. So we have sacral spinous processes as well as these inferior lumbars. Okay, so we don't even have to know which lumbar it is, just these inferior, the lower lumbar spinous processes, right? And remember, the spinous process is the posterior projection coming off of the vertebrae that we can all see right here. Okay, so fantastic. Now we know the origin for all three of these muscles. All right, now iliocostylis is also a little weird. It also is muscles within muscles. And so you can see the muscle here, but you can also see with these asterisks that there is also some of the iliocostylis up here more superiorly. All right, cool. So we know the origin. Let's go to insertion. The insertion is going to be hopefully kind of obvious. You can see it if this is the origin down here. The insertion over here we can see is along the ribs. Specifically, this is where the ribs curve, and we call that the angle of the rib. Okay. It also is going to insert along the transverse processes of C4 and C6. So that's where we have up here, it's going to insert on those lateral projections off the vertebrae of C4 and C6. So it would be somewhere in this region as well. Okay. So for except for longissimus, the iliocostylis and spinalis have similar actions. Okay, so the iliocostylis action is going to essentially just extend the vertebral column, right? Because we can see the insertion along here, and this is the erecti spinae group. So this is really just going to be muscles that are assisting with pulling the back posteriorly. So kind of erect yourself, right? Kind of arch your back posteriorly, and you'll be igniting these muscles. All right. And now, because it is on both sides of the body, there is this unilateral. So you can laterally flex your vertebral column. So you can kind of move your trunk to one side and to the other. And again, you'd be igniting that iliocostylis muscle. Okay. So the spinalis is also going to have that action. But like we talked about with longissimus, this intermediate one, longissimus has the same action as the splenius muscle, right? So, and that kind of makes sense because if we notice longissimus, again, the origin's down here, so that means the insertion has to be up here. Longissimus is attaching to the head. So it makes sense that it would have a similar action as the splenius, which is also attaching to the head. Okay. So Dr. Mraz-Craig says that longissimus, it's so long it goes to the head. So that could be a little helpful trick for you to remember that of the erector spinae group, the longissimus is the one that has the action of extending the head and neck because it inserts along the head. Let's talk about that specific insertion point for longissimus. It's specifically the transverse processes of cervical and thoracic vertebrae, but also the mastoid process along the temporal bone. So you can see it is inserting along here, but also we have that insertion at the mastoid process. Again, that is up the temporalis bone, and that is that projection hanging inferiorly right behind your ear. Okay. So spinalis is, of course, the most medial of the erector spinae group, right? So again, all of these are going to be helping with pulling the back posteriorly. They're erecting the spine, right? So we already know the origin, and we already know the action because it's the same as the iliocostylis, and we already know the innervation. So the only new thing that we have to learn for spinalis is the insertion. And that's going to be the spinous process of the cervical and thoracic vertebrae, which we can see here. So cervical and thoracic. And then we can see the insertion coming down along the iliac crest, posterior sacrum, inferior lumbar, and sacral spinal process. Yay. Okay. So that is, again, those 4 are considered superficial epaxial, but these 3, ilio, long, and spinal, these 3 are going to be considered the erector spinae group. Okay. Then we can get into the intermediate epaxial muscles. And this will be the last group of epaxial muscles that we do. Typically, there are superficial, intermediate, and deep within a group. We just don't talk. We're not testing you on the deep. Okay, so we'll stop at the intermediate. So here we have the semispinalis and the multifidus. All right. So just looking at them, semispinalis, we can see is attaching to the head. So we can remember that also is going to share the same action as longissimus and the splenius, right? But then multifidus looks super unique, right? It kind of looks like a braid, like a braided hair coming down, like a horsetail almost. So that's just kind of super obvious to identify. If I were just to show you this image, what is this muscle? You're looking at the braid, and you can see that there's multiple parts of it. So multifidus. All right. Now, typically, this multifidus won't be on the cadavers, just because it's pretty intricate, and it just isn't always exposed. Maybe portions of it could be exposed. All right. So let's talk about origins and insertions. All right. So semispinalis, right? Its origin is going to be along the transverse processes of the cervical and thoracic vertebrae. So we can see that lateral origin, that lateral attachment along those transverse processes. Okay. Multifidus is actually going to have very similar origin, except it's of cervical 2, C2, not C1. And you can see that. You can see that it starts at C2, which we call axis, and it goes all the way through the cervical vertebrae. Whereas semispinalis is just going through the thoracic vertebrae. You can see it stops after the ribs. I'm sorry, like as the ribs stop, the muscle origin stops. All right. So with the insertion semispinalis, we can kind of see that it is going to be inserting at the occipital bone along the back of the bone. But it also says spinous processes of vertebrae 6-7 segments superior to the origin. Okay, so there are portions of the muscle that if you go from the origin and then go up 6 to 7 segments, and you'll see insertion points along that spinous process of the vertebrae. All right, and as well as up here along the occipital. All right, so again, we already know the action. It's inserting on the head as well as along the neck. So it is going to extend the head and neck, and it's, it's on both sides. So it could be unilateral by flexing your head, going, moving towards your shoulders. So flexing the neck to one side. And then, of course, the innervation is the same as the other 4 that we've already talked about, the cervical and thoracic dorsal rami of spinal nerves. So multifidus, we've talked about the origin, and we can see how it goes from C2 all the way through the sacral vertebrae. All right. But multifidus also has kind of a weird insertion. So it says spinous processes of vertebrae 2 to 3 segments superior to origin. All right. So it's referring to each of these segments. It'll originate down here on the transverse process, and then going 2 to 3 segments up, it'll insert along the spinous processes of these vertebrae. All right. And the action of multifidus is going to be extending the vertebral column. All right. So because it is so medial along this vertebral column, it is going to be extending it. All right. And then because it is on both sides, we can have that unilateral flexion of the vertebral column to either side of the body. Now, multifidus is the only one of the epaxial group that has a different innervation. And the innervation for multifidus is the dorsal rami of all spinal nerves. Okay, because we can see that it goes all the way down the spinal cord. It goes all the way down the vertebral column. So it's going to be using those dorsal rami of all the spinal nerves. Okay, and that is the epaxial muscles.